Thank you very much to be here. And I want to start why we're doing this talk, and then we will see how we have an understanding of the load and how we use it for our day-to-day work. So when I became a manager, what happened to me is that I started feeling a lot of pressure, started feeling a lot of unable to get results. And at the beginning, I thought it was alone and like, hey, maybe I'm feeling burnout and other things. The interesting part is that I was not alone. A lot of people is feeling this full capacity, this burnout, unable to get things done, unable to move forward, and then draining us more and more into a low performing stage, right? At the same time, I thought that this was the only way to give business value. So that's another thing that I was like, hey, I'm doing this because it should have business impact. But I found is that it's not. When we are like in these conditions about high pressure, high cognitive load, it really doesn't translate directly into business impact. So for the long time, I wasn't able to articulate how to make it like a good health environment and good teams at the same time I'm delivering value. And then team topologies happened. And it brings me this question about, hey, maybe if we measure cognitive load and understand it, maybe we can have healthy teams at the same time that we have business impact. So I found like, okay, maybe here is something I can use to drive meaningful action, meaningful business impact. At the same time, I'm not burning out as myself or the people around me as a technical leader. And the question was like how we measure cognitive load, what it is, and here Laura will help us to get more in detail.
Well, thank you. I'm Laura. It's this wonderful outfit, wonderful penguin outfit of myself, so just 2 minutes about myself. I'm an academic, or at least an ex-academic. I'm still doing a bit of research. I'm involved with various universities in London. So my background is in organisational and social psychology. I also have an athlete background. I used to box for England, so I used to be up in Sheffield quite a lot. Now I'm an international referee. I then moved into AI, so I worked for an AI company for 7 years, leading the Future of Work venture and mainly building HR tech, but also doing quite a lot of consulting in the people analytics space. And I recently moved into a new role at WPP as Global Talent Innovation. I still have to read that off. That's just a week ago. So Global Talent Innovation Director. That is my new title. Down. Okay. So what's it like to work where you work? It's probably quite busy. Everyone has been asked to do more with less. So as a psychologist, I'm asking myself, how is this actually affecting our brain? So I start with collecting some data. So I talk to a lot of people in the organisation, day in, day out, and these are some of the most kind of popular sentiments. This work feels pointless. And they're really honest. If there's psychological safety, they will say that. Why do I have to do it like this? Requirements keep changing. Can I speak up about this issue? I feel like I'm walking on eggshells. Can I ask for help? I feel misunderstood. I'm not appreciated here. Why can't I think straight? It's too noisy. This stupid tool is not working. Why does everything take so long? I feel paralyzed by all these tasks. My brain feels fried. This is all too much. I won't do the TED Talk thing of asking you to raise your hand if you've experienced any of these. I assume you have, and if you haven't, please come on stage now and tell us your secret. If you haven't, I will get you on stage, I promise you, and you will tell us how you have never experienced any of these, because I'm super curious. So what these sentiments have all in common is that they can induce stress and frustration, and they lead to what we call cognitive overload. So I'm a diligent scientist, so I'm going to have to give you a little bit of theory here. We'll start with capacity theory of attention, and that was introduced by our friend Daniel Kahneman. Most of you will have heard of him. And he was actually the first one to make explicit that that there's a limit to our human cognition and our attention span. Then attentional control theory was proposed by a British psychologist called Michael Eysanck, and he said it's not actually just the pure load. Emotions and feelings matter. If you're stressed, if you feel anxiety, that will also really impact your capacity. So if you're stressed and if you feel a lot of anxiety, you will know that it's harder to recall things. Hence, giving a talk up here right now is quite stressful, and it's hard sometimes to remember what you want to say. Cognitive load theory, as mentioned in the team topologies book, is a classic theory proposed by John Sweller, and it talks about 3 types of cognitive load. Intrinsic cognitive load, which is about task complexity. So I should probably first say it's really focused on learning. And we know there's a little bit more happening in the workplace, and hence there's other theories that matter. But the cognitive load theory is really kind of focused on how do we learn. So intrinsic cognitive load is about how difficult the complexity of the task at hand. Extraneous cognitive load is how is that information presented. So, sometimes information is presented in a way that helps you with learning, and sometimes information is presented in a way and you're like, I don't understand this is not working for me. And then lastly, germane cognitive load, and that one is a bit of a funny one because it's considered to be a positive cognitive load, and it's really more of a process. It means the load and the energy that is required to integrate new knowledge or new information into existing schemas. And that's the kind of like really effective learning, because that's kind of how you're going to remember stuff effectively. Then cognitive overload theory is all about what happens if there's too much load. So what are the effects on decision making, for example? What are the effects on learning, on motivation, on your well-being, and so on? And lastly, information theory, we all know it's kind of linked to what we call the information society. There's so much information out there, and that can get quite overwhelming, and it will affect how we process information, and it will affect how we feel about it. Actually, there was a recent Nature study, and it compared this information overload to an environmental pollution, kind of a bit like water and air, due to its widespread effect on social interaction and decision making. So lastly, we considered all sorts of psychological theories around how groups function and how they achieve their goals. And we did that because the unit of analysis for team cognitive load is the team. And let me talk a little bit about why the team is the unit of analysis. So I did my PhD in organisational network analytics, so social network analytics. And the key premise of social network analytics is that nothing exists in isolation, only in relation. So we need to consider people always in the context of their social environment. So let me share my favorite, quite cheesy analogy with you. Coal and diamonds are both made of carbon, but they have vastly different properties, and that depends on how the carbon atoms are actually connected. It depends on the structure, it depends on the pressure under which those carbon atoms are. And similar in a team, you will know sometimes you get the best individuals in one team, but if they're not working together effectively, then it might really not be as successful as you would have hoped. It can actually be awful. Sometimes if I put the most intelligent people into a room, that might just not be a good idea at all. And this is where it gets really cheesy. So depending on the structure and how these individual elements are actually connected, you might get something that is brittle and dark and not transparent, or you get something that's transparent and valuable and bright. So I quite like that one. Okay, so why is cognitive load so important to consider right now? As we all know, there is fast technological progress at the moment going on, and that affects our ways of working continuously. So we have to adapt a lot. We have to adapt to those changes. That introduces new complexities, and it introduces interdependence between people. But because the way we work is more and more distributed, that actually introduces more complexity in how people collaborate, and it makes collaboration more difficult. Because of this constant change and this constant need to upskill and to learn new ways of working, there's a need for lifelong learning. And that is somehow exciting, but it also means that you have to take in information and new and adapt your ways of thinking all the time, and that introduces a lot of cognitive load. What about AI? No talk without AI, I'm sure, these days. It's somewhat mixed. We predict it to be somewhat mixed, the effect of AI on cognitive load. So on the one hand, we know it can help tremendously with, automating some of the routine tasks that we have to do that are really annoying and can cause a lot of cognitive load. It can enhance decision making if you're using it properly, so it can help with decision making when you use predictive analytics or prescriptive analytics. And it can personalize information, and personalized information is a lot easier to digest. On the other hand, because of AI, work is continuously changing and the requirements are continuously changing. Because of AI, there's new systems we have to maintain and we have to oversee the decisions because, as we all know, we can't really just straightforward trust AI, the decisions AI systems are making. We shouldn't, at least, anyway. The effects on managing information is somewhat mixed. So think of ChatGPT, for example. It can create loads and loads of information, and that can be quite overwhelming. On the other hand, and this is probably how I use ChatGPT the most, I just chuck something in and be like, give me a summary or make it more concise or extract these bits and bobs, and it becomes actually easier, and it helps you to learn, it helps you to process relevant information. So cognitive load is normal, and it's not necessarily a bad thing at all. It's if it's too much and if it's too regular. So think of a car engine. It's totally fine to run the car on the autobahn here and there, and you go full speed and you go full capacity. It might even be good for the car. However, if you run it too long at full capacity, it will burn out. Similar, if you use your brain too much, if you use the cognitive engine too much, and if the load is too high, it will lead to mental fatigue and burnout. So let's stick with this analogy for a second. In today's knowledge organizations, people are can be seen as metaphorically similar to engines or machines. So knowledge and energy is combined from various different sources to create new knowledge, information, products or services, often in a really chaotic way. However, in a factory, it has a really kind of defined capacity, right? But managers, they rarely really consider the brain's capacity before they add new tasks or add complexity. And that's a real problem. Why do they not do that? Because it's difficult. It's really, really hard to judge sometimes, we don't have a speedometer, or we don't have some sort of way of, there's Aleix is running out of fuel and there will be like some light or whatever. So it's really hard to measure. It's really hard to understand when somebody is at capacity. So how do we measure cognitive load? Let's start by defining it. Team cognitive load refers to the collective cognitive burden experienced by a group working together. Overload occurs when a group's combined cognitive demands exceeds its processing capacity, impairing its effectiveness. So without something like a brain capacity monitor or some sort of dashboard where we can see what's going on in our employees' minds, we rely on self-report feedback. During my PhD, I started specializing on creating psychometric tools. I'm happy to talk you through after this talk around how I do that. It's an interesting, quite lengthy process, but I don't have the time to do that in this talk. But we created this self-assessment tool. One thing I need to mention is that we don't actually measure psychological load directly, and there's two main reasons for it. A, there is no valid assessment tool out there yet. If somebody knows a valid assessment tool, let me know. It's very hard to measure, even with things like EEG and so on, what somebody's cognitive load is. The second reason why we don't measure it directly is that even if you know somebody's levels of cognitive load, that's not necessarily, or the quantity is not actually actionable, and we're looking for actionable, right? So think about burnout or attrition. Like if you know your organizational attrition rate, that doesn't tell you what to do to prevent it. Similarly, if I know that you're burnt out, I don't know why, and so what do I do as a manager? So in order to change something, what we need to do is we need to understand the root causes of cognitive load, and this is what this tool does. So all the information about the scientific model and all those drivers you can find on the website, and again, you can talk to us afterwards. But just very briefly, we have identified 4 clusters: team characteristics, task characteristics, work practices and processes, and work environment and tools. In team characteristics, we look at the composition, so how complex is the team, that can have various different elements. The team competence, do we have the right competence? So I'm a psychologist, so there's a lot of psychological stuff in especially the team characteristics buckets. So roles, is there role clarity? You know, do people actually know what their role is in teams? A lot of times we assume that is very clear, but it's actually not. Member role fit. Do people fit into the team? Do they have the right skill set? Do they have the right expertise? And are they aware of that? Member role load, which is really about the workload. Then culture, team alignment, team interaction, collaboration, knowledge sharing, these sort of things. If that is not in place, that can create cognitive load. So those are all things that can create cognitive load in a team. And then lastly, member psychological safety. As I said before, Isaac said, if you are stressed, if you feel like you can't speak up, that can block your mind. So we need to look at things that relate to team psychological safety, because if the team is not safe, it creates that load, it creates that blocking in the head. Then task characteristics, which kind of plays to this intrinsic cognitive load, problem statement. Do we really know what the problem is? The amount of time I work at WPP, and I've worked at WPP for a while as a freelancer, and I work with various different teams, and there's some very established teams. And I'm like, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? And I get vastly different answers, even if the team has been working together for a long time. And that can create a lot of frustration. That can create a lot of inefficiencies. So is the problem statement clear? Are we clear on the solution? Okay, we understand the problem. Do we know what the solution looks like? And are we all okay with that? Are we all okay with the proposed solution? Complexity, task complexity, contextual complexity, task about the task, context, stakeholders, for example, can be, if you have various different stakeholders that speak different languages, can be super complex, can create a lot of load. Metrics, are we measuring? Can we establish where we are? Are the metrics clear? Do we know how to evaluate work? Work practices and processes, use of information. Do we have the right information? Do we have it at the right time? And so on. Efficiency and effectiveness and processes. Are the processes consistent? If the processes are not consistent, for some people in particular, it can be super frustrating. I'm one of them. Pace. Are we moving at the right pace? Are we moving too slow? Are we moving too quick? Performance. Do we know what good performance looks like? Are we performing well? If we're not performing well, if you constantly feel like you're not performing well, it will block you. Adaptability, really important. Iterative working, continuous learning. Is there space for that? Work environment and tools is very much around, if we think of the classic cognitive load theory, very much about the extraneous kind of load that's linked to that. So do we have the right tools? Do we have suitable tools, or should we not be using this tool because it's actually not fit for purpose? Are the tools performing well, or are they crashing all the time, which causes a lot of frustration, right? And then about the work environment. I can't work in an open plan office. I have ADHD. If I hear a lot of things around me, I'm not working at all. It's not working for me. So you need to consider, what do people need in terms of work environment to be effective, and to not consider, to not experience cognitive load. Cool, last slide. So where do we go from here? So we have built the model, we have tested the model, we have tested the framework, we looked at if it's valid, if it's reliable from a psychometric perspective. Good news it is. What do we do now? Here are the 3 kind of areas where we're looking at what we're looking into. So firstly, how do different groups experience cognitive load drivers? We know that people are experiencing the workplace really different depending on their demographic differences or their operational differences. So senior and junior people will experience the workplace quite different. Male and females will experience the workplace quite different. Neurotypical and neurodiverse people will experience the workplace quite different. The more we understand these differences and can start building different groups, like females in South America or whatever, like, bucket people in a certain way and understand the different cognitive load drivers they experience, the more actionable our interventions or our actions, the more targeted and hence the more effective they can be. How do cognitive load drivers affect outcomes of importance? We've done a study with 200 knowledge workers in the UK, and we kind of looked at the correlation between cognitive load drivers and things such as job satisfaction, burnout, and turnover intention, and unsurprisingly, we found very high correlation. So if you score really highly on pretty much all cognitive load drivers, you will be less satisfied, more likely to leave, and more burned out, or at least report that you're more burned out. The last one, cognitive load as success moderator, can effective management foster greater inclusivity. So at WPP recently, I'll just give you an example of that. We have a lot of focus on our neurodiverse talent. Why? Because we see that especially people that are neurodiverse are they can be incredibly creative, and they can really help kind of give that competitive edge. But what we find is that managing cognitive load drivers, especially in that community, is super important and disproportionately important to when you compare it to neurotypical individuals. So meaning that if they have, for example, role ambiguity, if they don't have a suitable workplace, if in terms of the environment, if they do not have structured and consistent work processes, their performance will be disproportionately affected, right? So they can be a massive asset in the workplace, but if you don't consider the individual needs, especially in terms of cognitive load, you're missing out as a manager. I think that's it for me. I'm going to hand back to Aleix.
So that is super relevant because we know that it is a good foundation of what we can build upon. But let me briefly introduce why we're doing this, or why I'm doing this particularly. So I was a developer, somehow frustrated because I wanted to solve the right things, and I noticed that I need to go into management to influence for the big organizations. One of the things that happened to me is that as a developer, I had testing, monitoring, observability. I had a lot of tooling that was telling me if I'm doing my job well or not. When I moved to management, I either had one-on-ones as a tool or NPS once a year. So between I do a decision until I understand the consequence, it was like way too much time. So it was super hard to understand what is going on and my decision impact without adding more meetings, which is something I hate as an engineer. So today, I will present you how using team cognitive load changed my journey as a leader. And it was 3 main phases, which is awareness, insights, and organizational sensing, that I will just show you how it changed how I lead as back then as a head of engineering. So let's start with awareness. So I joined a team, and what happened to me is that people were like talking about, hey, my problem is Jira, architecture isn't flexible enough, and people were quite vocal about the problems, like problem is tooling, architecture, and so on and so forth. So the first thing I noticed is that people tend to say, our problem is complexity and tooling. What they didn't know is that they just share what they know and they can control. So they were able to change maybe from Jira to another application and maybe change the architecture to one to another. So they're in control, and that's why they wanted to change something. But what they were vocal is because they didn't knew what they were causing cognitive load. And that's what we did. So when you start asking about the different things that are impacting them, you are giving them like, oh, I didn't thought about it too much as stakeholders. Maybe my CTO going through DMs through people to act stuff, maybe it's the problem about having too many things to do at the same time. So at that moment, you identify that even though the people were concentrating on the complexity of the task and tooling, the actual problem was a team composition and problem statement, right? So if you start funding initiatives to improve cognitive load in the wrong place, you just invest money and time but don't see any business result. So what we found is that we are giving people a shared language to know and say, hey, we are having this type of cognitive load, that's my problem. And then as a leader, when you receive information, you're like, okay, that's more accurate. It's also what I'm seeing. I see the problem. Okay, I'm able to connect the dots. Before I was like, I see a problem here, I don't see the connection there, how I connect both things. And this was providing the teams a way to express that frustration in a way that maybe they were unable to tackle by themselves, but able to do that with leadership. And that's when it got to insights. When you have something to focus on and you see like, oh, what is causing cognitive load for these teams is role clarity and task complexity, you're like, okay, that's a focus area that we can learn on. And then as a head of engineering, I'm like, okay, I have 6 teams. 5 of them have the same cognitive load problem. Maybe it's not an individual problem. Maybe it's a leadership problem. Maybe it's something we can do. Before, because people weren't able to have a shared language, people were signaling different things. And me as a leader, it was how I help you, because every one of you have different problems. It's super hard to build something cohesive. Now, I was able to have like, okay, if I do this initiative for these people, I can have a bigger impact from 1 to 5 to 6 teams. So this is what it really gives me, is like now I had data to go for my higher level leadership and able to drive change. Before it was like, hey, Aleix, but that's your thing. Can you just manage it and just don't bring it up? Yes, but this is outside my decision making. So how I create awareness with my higher ups, so there is a word like, hey, this is important, we shouldn't avoid tackling team cognitive load. So for the first meeting, maybe it doesn't work, but if you start doing it regularly and you see that these things get worse, people will start like, okay, why these things get worse? Maybe I should pay attention to this, and we are burning out people. So it was able to create awareness also, not only within the teams that were able to spell better what is the problem, but also connecting with other leadership peers to say, hey, we need to do something here as a team, as leadership team. And then what I think is that this is very rare that people get into this last stage of, I would say, maybe maturity or how to use team cognitive load as a sensing mechanism. But I think we got near it. So what we started doing is like any decision that was impactful enough, we measured the before cognitive load, decision afterwards cognitive load. And this was quite interesting because it brought us we learn from our mistakes, let's say it this way. So instead of waiting 2 months to learn from a mistake, or 3 months or more, we were just more like, okay, there's something happening here which is interesting. And this is what we started to do, like, hey, anytime we do something like split a team, new product initiative, new platform team, anything that is not disruptive, we needed to understand the consequences of leadership decisions so we are more conscious about their impact. The last point, which is merger and acquisition, that's quite interesting. I will mention it because that is not something I did. It was from a client, which is, hey, I want to use team cognitive load for measuring for a merger and acquisition because I know my state of my company, but is my other company I want to buy maybe burnout? They are having way too much load that we don't know. So we're trying to say, can we use this for due diligence? And when we merge, which is the impact within our company and overall. So that's quite interesting because then you know, like, okay, you know it will impact brutally, but instead of having everything over the place, you can focus on like, okay, I have these 3 things I need to address, so the merge is not as painful as before. So you're reducing pain as well as there, right? So quite good use case. I didn't thought about that, but worth to mention. So when you start doing this cognitive load assessment over time, you start seeing the organization as a team cognitive load and how it evolves. And I was able to like, okay, we did this decision here, it impacted that way. When we did it again, we improved and didn't impact the teams that way. So people saw us as leaders that, okay, they are mindful of the decision and they're trying to put solutions. So we got more engagement from them on the impact because we're understanding your points. So you can also see like we have assessing a team, you can try to address the cognitive loads and then help them and then see if there was an impact there. So I was able to find initiatives and then say, okay, is this initiative working or not? Then it was like, okay, we split the team, maybe added the platform team, is this paying off? Or we made the problem worse? So I was able to be like, able to go with my leadership and say, it's paying off, these are the results, maybe it's a good success pattern that we can copy to the rest of the organization as well. So we were quite good there. So we started using cognitive load for platform and enabling teams. If you have a platform team that is helping with speeding or something, you have a lot of metrics on maybe speed. But if you're having a speed and then impacting the cognitive load heavily, maybe you're not succeeding as you like. So you always need to, we had these two metrics at the same time so that the experience didn't get worse, instead it get better, right? So this is the feedback loop that at the end we found, which is maybe you have business and user needs that it should guide your conscious decisions, but understanding the cognitive load of your team, it will influence, like maybe we should not do this first and then manage the stakeholders first. So you know how to make your initiative more successful instead of just become just for failure, right? This will not work. So then I can tell which is the consequence. Just for finishing, team cognitive load is to drive the right conversations, not to avoid them. So just don't get the cognitive load, think decisions. That doesn't work. It should help you to say, okay, I want to talk about the team about this area instead of over the place. So do not skip people when using team cognitive load. It should have a humane conversation with the teams to drive the real impact. So that's what we are building. We're helping the community. That's why we have up to 3 teams for free. So you can try and improve maybe your team or your peer teams. So at the end, you're able to help and have less cognitive load. And yeah, we truly believe that managing cognitive load is the key for maximizing the value by enabling all employees to perform at the best. So business value and team health should be one to another. It's not like one or the other. So they are the same thing. And yeah, thank you very much.